recording. Let me see. Light's weird on me. That's just me, or we got weird light? I know you're used to very high protection values, but for some reason the light's very weird in my room. I think because it's getting lighter outside. It's that there's a light just shining right on my chest. And so I got to wear a green shirt. It is St. Patrick's Day. And are there any questions on the DBQ? Any questions at all? If you have a question on your thesis statement or want to talk about organizing or not sure about something, please put it in chat and I'll check it. I'll check it this afternoon and I'll answer any questions you have. And the odds are I'll answer it correctly. By the way, that is the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. Not only am I going to talk about the French Revolution, and it was built by Napoleon, but French Revolution. Also, that's where the French would make the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And the United States would copy that, and that's at Arlington. And so, good, okay. If there's no question, so tomorrow DBQ, and you will turn in an outline and a thesis. And the thesis has got to be for a 5-paragraph essay. But in your essay, do you actually turn in the actual essay itself, write it for a 4-paragraph essay? So instead of having A, B, and C for subtopics, you just have A and B, or however you want to do it. And remember, outline for 6 documents, you'll write for 4-paragraph essay, no quotes. Make sure you connect the documents to your thesis by addressing outside information, things outside the documents that that can reinforce the thesis statement. And don't forget, add in another example outside information. So you're going to need 3 examples, 2 from the thesis, 2 from the documents, and 1 from your information in each paragraph. But that's it's only 4 paragraphs. So have that organized. You will turn in your outline, type or write, but if you do write it, it's in pen. Pen is easier to write with. Your hand doesn't get as tired, but mistakes, trust me, I understand. And so if there are no questions, let us begin. We're talking about the 1920s, and we'll do a lot of the 20s today. We're going to watch a video on Friday, finish up anything on Monday. So let us begin. That's weird. You know why I think part of it is? There's outside. Okay, I see the little picture of myself, and it's just like I'm just like bright. You don't care, do you? You don't care at all. There's a house across the street that's white, and the sun is just hitting it exactly and coming right through the window. Yeah, I'm with you. I've lost interest now, too. All right, so let's go ahead and get started on this. The 1920s. And so weird. How do you enjoy me clicking this? Why won't it give me about? So they've made a change on this. They've changed their little controls on Google Slides. Okay, so let's get to the 1920s. And this we talked about in class. I added the word demobilization because this was in my 20 notes, and I had it at the end of World War I notes. And so don't forget, this is where the United States demobilized the military. There's massive inflation, and also they had to retool from consumer goods to okay. Woman across the street now is playing with a tennis ball and her dogs. It made me laugh. Dogs are pretty funny. Okay, so back to this. So they had to retune the consumer goods. And the problem was there's such a shortage of consumer goods, and um, it led to massive inflation at the same time that there was all these unemployed. They'll get a name for that called stagflation, of high inflation and high unemployment. That's not supposed to happen. If there's bad economic times, there's supposed to be deflation. But you can see in this picture here how the economy shrunk dramatically. And this is basically per capita gross national product, a very generic measurement of all goods and services sold in the United States. And wages did not keep up. And you see this picture in the corner there? Workers, they sacrificed. They dealt with the very high prices in 1918. But in 1919, they'd had enough. And this is going to begin a series of strikes all over the United States. And the strikes are going to be some of the biggest and most violent strikes in the United States. Because don't forget, the United States, for most of its history, the government has been basically pro-business, pro-very narrow organization, and very anti-union, anti-worker. And so with that, first off, wages did not keep up with inflation. And so workers said, now we demand higher wages. Well, you can imagine how companies, in fact, all employers, they didn't want to raise wages because there was a shortage, good and bad economic time. But at the same time, workers were really suffering. And so in Boston, there was a longshoreman strike, and that turned into a general strike. A longshoreman are people who unload ships. And this would eventually spread to San Francisco, Los Angeles, and nationwide. In Boston, policemen went on strike, and it was unclear if police could go on strike. They're public employees. If police go on strike, would that lead to a rash of crime? But usually that you can imagine how that could be used to tell public employees, oh, you can't strike. It'll affect other people. It'll affect, just a sec. That's weird. It'll affect crime, so you can't complain and organize for higher wages. I mean, I'm a teacher. Teachers are told that all the time. You can't complain about higher wages because kids will suffer. Well, this is my job, as you well know. So anyways, and but also police were the main weapon against unions. And so this was quite a shocking strike. And Calvin Coolidge in Mayor of Boston, and then he would make a name for himself as putting down this strike in Boston. And this, and then the biggest strike of them all, sorry, I'm off. Come on. Sorry. The biggest strike of them all would be in West Virginia. It's called the West Virginia coal mine work. The miners, unbelievably dangerous job. 100 would be killed or wounded every week. That picture of the mules and those little boys in the mines, that is not a picture from 1840. That is a picture from 1920. And eventually the National Guard would be called out, and a violent put down of the labor union, crushing the labor union and forcing workers to take much lower wages. West Virginia has a very interesting history towards workers. So I'm having all kinds of computer issues. So here's the thing, though, that happened. War madness was still going on, and there was a real kind of worry. Strikes. Were these workers fighting for rights? Or was this that revolution that everybody feared? Was this that revolution that maybe the Germans started pushing in World War I, the Socialist Revolution, and now it's happening in the United States, just like the Soviet Union? And it appeared to be elements of this happening in the new German Republic. There seemed to be maybe perhaps this in Eastern Europe, and socialist parties were on the rise in France and Britain. Maybe this was that revolution. And so here is an anti-Bolshevik cartoon saying, it's implying Bolshevik radicals. And here, Uncle Sam whipping the labor unions and saying, I'm sick and tired of this, implying that strikers were just simply striking because they're being petulant babies and not the fact that their wages were low and tens, if not hundreds, were dying or being maimed every month. But remember this, you can't shut off the feeling of total war and this idea of looking for the enemy. Speaking of that, I mentioned yesterday, or a few weeks ago, talking about the ideas of looking out for the enemy, war madness, the idea you cannot allow dissent within a country during total war because that might mean the enemy is winning, and we see right now. So yesterday it came out that there were 4,000 reported cases of violence against Asian Americans because of anger over the coronavirus, of COVID-19. There's lots of coronavirus. Got to say COVID-19. And then last night, it appears as though 8 people were murdered, 6 of them Asian, by a young man. And this appears to be related to anti-Asian feelings amongst certain Americans because of the COVID-19. And remember what I told you, how you can't shut that off. We see this time after time in history. We get this feeling where we have this enemy with them, we got anger with them, and people start taking the law in their own hand. Remember Frank Little in Butte. And so at the same time, there was a wave of anarchist attacks, which is kind of interesting because anarchism was dying fast in the United States. It was not popular. This was like their last gasp. But there were at least 50 attacks, including mail and package bombs, all over the United States, one targeting Attorney General Palmer, who was just recently appointed by President Wilson as the new Attorney General. And this is the shot of the house with windows blown up, and he was wounded. But on Wall Street, one of the biggest terrorist attacks in American history took place. The Wall Street bombing would kill 38 people as a bomb in a cart outside of the stock exchange blew up. We're still not sure who did it, but what this, combined with the strikes, led to a wave of fear of revolution. And don't forget what total war told people. Is this an example of homegrown terrorists or an example of anger within, or is the enemy winning? Are we going to have our own Bolshevik revolution? And this is going to begin the Red Scare. I have to stop this because for some reason my shot of the IWW covered up. There we go. You like the creative process? I know you do. Okay, so still working good. This will become known as the Red Scare. As Attorney General Palmer, who now it's personal because he was actually a target of this. The Justice Department would begin a series of raids. Actually, back then, the Justice Department could not arrest people within the states. What's going to be called the Bureau of Investigation could not arrest people. They had to be with local police. It would not be until the 1930s that the Bureau of Investigation, combined with Treasury officers who looked out for prohibition, would combine into the FBI. Would be to the 30s that they could actually arrest people. But that's another story. They begin to go door to door and begin looking for radical Reds who are going to destroy the United States. But who did it really come to? Anti-union. This was a way to attack the union. These strikes must be connected to the anarchists. They're Bolsheviks. It's no longer bomb-throwing anarchists. It's labor unions are Bolsheviks. And so the international workers of the world, remember the Wobblies and Frank Little? This would destroy them. In fact, here's a cartoon showing American institutions as a guy going to kill the Bolshevik who's going to get into the granary. That's supposed to be ears of corn. And by the way, this cartoon was made by Ford Motor Company to keep out labor unions. And here they are being run out by the new group called the American Legion, which was a group of veterans still around. And this anti-union violence would destroy labor unions for the 1920s, absolutely destroy them. And they never recovered again until President Roosevelt and the Great Depression. And so combine that with, I got this out of order, so I don't know how I did this. Everyone, I moved something around. I made a mistake. So back to this. At the same time, there is a phenomenon. It's happened a couple different times in history, but where there's going to be massive waves of people moving in the United States. It would be called the Great Migration. And what happened is hundreds of thousands every year from 1912 to 1920, hundreds of thousands of African Americans begin to move out of the South, either abandoning or running away from sharecroppers' farms or being kicked off, and moving north to the new industrial jobs in the North, especially during World War I, when there's such a massive demand for the jobs. And as they moved north, remember I told you about sundown towns, towns where African Americans were not allowed in after dark or they would be lynched. And there were over 10,000 of these sundown towns all over the North, the Plains, the West, including all over Montana. And not just blacks were not allowed, American Indians, Asian Americans, etc. Yeah, racism was equal opportunity, so to speak. But that meant they only settled in urban towns. And so I didn't write that down, but urban areas. And so Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Newark, places where there's a lot of industrial growth and mostly segregated in these towns, massive waves of immigrants coming north. And this was a dramatic shift because, yes, there's a lot of racism all over the United States. This was the most racist time. But while this is going on, this is going into the 1920s. While this is going on, you're going to have a real shift in thinking about race. Jim Crow is becoming ascendant in the South. There's going to be reemergence of the lost cause myth about the Civil War. And, well, we'll get to it. And so here are a couple examples of during this time about blacks moving into white areas. Here's in Georgia. Here is outside of Chicago, Illinois. There's another one of Chicago. And it's telling people coming to town, new migrants, please come ask us for help because you don't want to live in an area where you might be lynched. And with that, it's no coincidence that the Great Migration directly led to the reemergence of the KKK. And they considered themselves true Americans. They were anti-immigrant, anti-Jewish, anti-black. And also, I should have put down anti-Catholic. Because anti-immigrant, a number of things anti-immigrant were not just Jewish immigrants, but a lot of Catholic immigrants. Remember the nativism? So here's the Klan, and it's showing the end. Here's Yay America, and it appears as though they just murdered the Pope. Here is a Klan rally in 1924 in Washington, D.C., and it's no coincidence that the birth of the nation, which I mentioned before, Reconstruction and Woodrow Wilson, there's a little Woodrow Wilson quote on this. The Klan reemerged all over the United States. Confederate monuments went all over just at a time of the Great Migration, where significant numbers of African Americans moved into large cities in the North where they had never lived before. In fact, it would be this era, that the small but vibrant African American and Asian American communities in Helena were run out of town. They just gone by the 1930s. And the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, would soon come to dominate parties in individual states. In some states, they were Democrats. In some states, they were Republicans. It really depended upon the state. There's a myth that the KKK were Democrats because the Solid South were Democrats. And that is just simply a total misunderstanding of history. Yeah, sure. The Klan did reemerge a little bit in Louisiana, Georgia, and a few other places in the South. And they were Democrats because they're all Democrats. But in Indiana, the Klan would run the party or run the state, and they were all Republicans. And I know what you're thinking, but wait a second. Do you have a picture of Klansmen on a Ferris wheel for the 1920s? And the answer is, of course I do. And so, when this happened, I should have, before we get to that, when this happened, there's still this Great Migration. You have all these white soldiers, black soldiers, all these people, Americans who went out to fight for war, they came back to these big parades. And even though white units and black units were segregated in places like Detroit or Washington, D.C., there were parades of black and white soldiers. People came out and cheered and celebrated them. And there was a real feeling that perhaps, some of the discrimination, mostly legal racism against blacks, could be alleviated in this euphoria of winning the war. But no, there's xenophobia created, looking out for the enemy. We have the Red Scare, and then we have what's called Red Summer at the same time. And these were, you notice I put in quotes, race riots, as they were called. Over 60 cities all that summer. Washington, D.C. and Chicago were two of the worst. In fact, Washington, D.C. was basically shut down for a couple days. The National Guard was called out. A still slowly recovering, but never fully recovered, Wilson basically had no comment about this. There were gunfights in the streets. Mostly these were attacks by police and armed bands of vigilantes, white vigilantes who attacked blacks. Blacks armed themselves and fought back. In fact, there's going to be some of the first gun control laws. We see the same things in the 60s to keep guns out of the hands of African Americans. That's another story. But this spread throughout the United States. At least 1,000 people were killed or wounded, and it's called Red Summer, the red for the color of American citizens, African Americans' blood, all over. So we have Red Summer and the Red Scare. And a lot of people confuse these and get them mixed up. And so here's a picture of a couple. This is in Washington, D.C., of National Guardsmen going through the town. Here is the lynching. This is May of 1918. There was a big, almost always was black, many times veterans, still wearing their uniforms, attacked and arrested by police. Here is a story saying, this is in Chicago, Negroes plan to kill all whites, was put in the newspaper, which of course is simply not true at all. But here are vigilantes going through the streets, burning down homes of white people. I'm sorry, burning down homes of black people. I'm sorry, the dogs are running around. It caught my eye. I know. I got to shut my shade. And here are National Guardsmen accosting an African American. And you notice and he is also a veteran of the war. But these would culminate in probably the biggest of the race riots of the 20th century, of the anti-black riots. And that was in Tulsa, 1921. A young black man was accused of a rape of a white woman. Almost certainly they had maybe dated, but in Tulsa, which is kind of a southern state, white women were not supposed to go out with black men. And so she basically said he was raped, even though there was no evidence. This led to a massive attack on the black community called Little Africa in Tulsa. Now it's called Little Wall Street. And one thing that happened in these segregated towns in the South and states like Oklahoma and Kansas, which are also very racist states, there's a very vibrant black community within these towns. And roving gangs of whites with rifles, with fire and maul, they went through the town and burnt it down. Here's a picture, and they sold these as postcards of Little Africa on fire. And here's the Tulsa Klan. Remember, they got started again after Birth of the Nation, burning a cross after this is over, kind of a celebration. They destroyed that entire community. We don't know how many people were killed. Anywhere from 200 to 300 is a prediction. It used to be thought to be a lot lower, but last year they discovered a mass grave of people, and so it appears to be much bigger than they thought. They even used the Oklahoma National Guard to shell part of it with small artillery, and the very small Oklahoma Air National Guard dropped bombs on Little Africa during this affair. And while that's going on, the perpetual activity all through the 1920s of lynching African American men, almost always men, torturing to death and hanging them, making a big celebration of it, and nobody was ever arrested. This is outside the NAACP headquarters in New York City in 1928. A man was lynched today. They would put that flag out there, desperate for an anti-lynching law, which technically we still do not have. And so it's no coincidence that in 1924, the United States would pass the National Origins Act. And this was the first major restriction on immigration in American history. And so if you build up xenophobia and fear of immigrants and fear of others, fear of people coming in and changing who we are, upturning the proper order of things, it's no coincidence that this act, the first massive one, and basically it allowed only some immigrants, and they set up quotas, some immigrants from Northwestern Europe. And this shows how there was a big wave of immigrants from Southeastern Europe, Southeastern Europe, Southeastern Europe. And this shows 21 to 1930, you could see the effects of this limiting the number from South and Eastern Europe. And the whole goal was to keep out these dangerous, radical immigrants. And so once again, here's another example of that wall that would be put into place to keep out immigrants. The wall rhetoric that some of you thought, oh, that's only a thing that President Trump used in my lifetime in 1916 to get elected president. Did I say 1916? 2016 would also happen here. And here's another good cartoon, and it's showing all these people from Europe, and here's a funnel just to keep a few of the good ones in. But when they meant dangerous immigrants, the radical ones, they meant keeping out non-white. And they literally went through by quota and decided who was white and who was not. And who was white, certain percentages would be allowed in. So if you're from Norway, you had a better chance of getting in than if you were from Italy. And Italy had a better chance than Turkey. But for example, with a lot of lobbying, Turks became white, just not as white as somebody from Germany. And it's absolutely amazing what happened. And this is where we get this obsession with race. We have to keep out the inferior races. And you can see how that relates directly to what happened in Red Summer, what happened all across the United States. And a new science that had begun actually 20 years earlier took hold all across the so-called scientific community. I'm using quotes there because this is very sciencey. And it's going to be called eugenics. And eugenics is going to be this concept that we have got to encourage, if not enforce, selective breeding. So we don't have intermixing of the races. And don't forget, I've showed you this before when we talked about imperialism. There are people who believe there are over 39 different races. And so we're going to keep out different races. And so here is this idea of heredity is a big problem. We got to make sure that feeble-minded people don't breed with normal people, just as you would not let, or just as a dairyman would carefully select cattle. We could breed that. So what does that really mean? We better make sure that pure white people don't breed with people that aren't as white or not white at all. And so there was also this obsession with a hierarchy of races. So here's another one from the early 1920s. And it's talking about the early Stone Age and the ascent of man. How you notice you have gorilla, chimpanzee, these are supposed to be skulls. And now they have a hierarchy of humans. Caucasian, Chinese, Hottentot, Australian. They can't help themselves, they're inferior, but you don't want to breed these because then that will dilute the human race. And let's be very clear about this. I told you a little bit earlier about culture and this German fake mythology / science. Doesn't this fit nicely in this? Oh, and add two more words to this. This fits in very well with social Darwinism. But as African Americans did move north by the mid-1920s in urban areas, segregated, a significant number of migrants moved into the area called Harlem, which is in the northern part of Manhattan Island. And here would be a flowering of African American culture, music, dance. For the first time, there could be clubs that would allow for large clubs that would allow for African American artists. For example, here's the great Cab Calloway and his jazz swing band, changing the nature of music forever. There's the famous Cotton Club, and it's still there in Harlem. But this was African American culture. And this tied in with what we're going to call the Roaring Twenties, because the Roaring Twenties would be this mythological idea of what the 20s were. I just told you the racial and prejudice and racism that happened in the 1920s, along with anti-union activities that kept wages low. But there is a feeling that the 20s were a time of excitement and glamour. So there's a New Year's Eve party in New York City in 1928. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because in the tough times of the 1930s and 40s, there was almost this desperation to look back to the 1920s and say, boy, times were so good in the 1920s. The Roaring Twenties, we had so much fun, I wish we could go back. And you see the same things all the way to the 1940s. You see the exact same thinking in the tough 1970s, which were not as tough as people thought, but the tough 1970s, and going back to the 1950s. You know, the most popular television show was just a sec. The most popular television show was Happy Days, about the 1920s. And so this was the myth of the 1920s. The myth of the Roaring Twenties, of excitement and glamour. And it hit a really big underbelly, as I told you, part of it right now. This fun and glamour, but the other thing was this constant prosperity. This belief that the country was booming economically. Now, part of that was it started off with such a bad economy in 1921 that it grew for 6 years along with the world's economy as it rebuilt, and it gave the illusion of massive growth. In my lifetime, that has happened a few times, most famously in the mid-1980s, and we had a horrible recession in 1982. Also in the mid-2000s, 2004, 2005, 2006. We saw a little bit of this also just in the last few years before COVID hit. And part of it was this new prosperity was this idea that we don't need to worry about social morality or social justice. Let the individual make decisions for themselves, sink or swim. Glorification of the individual. And also no coincidence that the first movies, almost all of them would be silent movies, where the West, we're kind of creating this mythology of the West, the Wild West. And they made up this thing about the gunfighter and the quick draw and all that. So the reality, the 20s were a pretty rough time. Racial, economic problems combined with a depression at the beginning of the decade and a horrific depression at the end. The 20s were a lot of illusion. Sorry. And the vigilante parade. So here is a big deer in the parade. Okay. Can't make that up. Okay. So conservatism. And so this also would be the era where we really start hearing the word conservative a lot. And not just conservative as the idea of laissez-faire economics, it became more of an attitude. And this actually goes back to the reaction against the French Revolution, but this is going to be a reaction against the progressive era and giving women the right to vote, African Americans demanding rights, the Great Migration, post-war, fear of revolution, and the development of a new form of evangelical Christianity called fundamentalism. And it came from this book written in 1913 called The Fundamentals of Christ. But it was a major idea of concept of looking back to the way it was, or religion was supposed to be. And a new reading of the Bible, the reading for, and that's a big change for Christianity, for some Christians that is, that a new reading about the way that salvation is going to happen. And this growth of people who believe that salvation could happen at any time, and the second coming will happen at any time. And have you ever heard of the term the rapture? Came out of this movement of fundamentalism. And so there are these kind of quasi-patriotic / religious tent revival meetings. And here's one right here of preachers like Billy Sunday and others, these tent evangelical religions where they come out and they give these fire and brimstone speeches. Did you hear that too? Holding people in the palm of their hands. They were called charismatics. And a lot of it had to do with this fear of the modern world. I should add that heaven or hell is your choice as a sign from North Carolina in 1926. Basically saying the choice is coming, you better make it right now. But it's a fear of this modern world, because one of the factors about the 1920s, and where this desire or this real fear that the world was changing too fast. We had mass industrialization. Don't forget, the second industrial revolution is really only 30 years old. And by the 1920s, a significant number of homes have had electrification. They're connected by telephones. By the middle of the decade, people could buy radios. There was assembly lines. The whole economic system was changing radically fast. And people were scared of this radical change. At the same time, this fear of this foreign influence coming in, dangerous anarchists, well, now Bolsheviks, the Great Migration, this fear of this new modern world. We'll see the same thing in the Second Great Awakening in the 1840s. But there's also a fear of people, of the traditional power structure crumbling in the 1920s. Of those who were on top might be losing power, might be losing their status. Remember Bacon's Rebellion many months ago, we talked about it in class, where whites and poor whites, poor American Indians, poor African, people of African descent revolt against the power struggle in Virginia and nearly toppled the government. And so they created slave codes, most importantly, the fornication laws. And it began poor whites to feel, I don't have much, but at least I'm white. And so they would fight like heck to keep that little bit of status. Remember, it was poor whites who never going to have slaves, were the bulk of the soldiers, almost all of them, who would fight to protect slavery in the Civil War. We have a similar thing where there's a feeling that the old power structure is being toppled, and I don't want to lose my status. That is why we have this time of nativism. Don't forget the Great Migration coming in. And this was intensely social Darwinistic. Don't forget that term, social Darwinism. That philosophy is intertwined so much from the 1920s through, let me look at my watch, today. And this really big idea that let's go back to an idealized time, which is kind of ironic because the 1920s were seen as this time of great prosperity after the 20s, but many people during the 20s, they wanted to go back to what they called the gay 90s, which is also incredible. The 1890s were the time of one of the worst economic disasters in history. And this idealized time is a very important concept. They don't want to go back to the 1890s. They want to go back to their vision of the way things were in the 1890s, or at least the way things should have been in the 1890s, where people knew their place, where people, the right people were on top, the right people, or the right, you could say family, the right government, the right leaders, and we didn't have all this disruption. Oh, sure, there are some problems back then. We don't want that to happen, but let's go back to that time. And so that's when you see the same thing when the 1970s, when people want to look back to the 1950s. And then when they were reminded, wait a minute, the 50s weren't all that great. Poverty was really high, and there's a lot of racism. We didn't have the Voting Rights Act or the Civil Rights Act. People say, well, I didn't want that. I just want other parts of it. So it's more like the way things should have been, which, by the way, is a pretty common concept. Every year you get older, you'll be looking that way. In fact, how many of you said, oh, these freshmen aren't like us? Same thing. So that idea of the good old days. And I can't emphasize this enough. This idea where people knew their place. They knew their place. You didn't have all these people from the South, and they would say all these people, black people from the South moving up north and taking our neighborhoods, were a significant number of people thinking that. Sorry. I shouldn't look out the window. There's like 45 pigeons sitting on the street. Oh, they just all flew off. So a best example of that, and last thing for today, was the Scopes monkey trial. Now, so we call this Scopes monkey trial because it showed the growth of fundamentalism, and this is also widely misunderstood. And in Dayton, Tennessee, a substitute teacher is going to be arrested for teaching evolution. Now, let's be very clear about it. Evolution, that comes from Darwin's theory of natural selection. And even though by then, most people who understood it understood that the concept of natural selection was not controversial at all. In fact, it's the basis of biological science. If you don't believe in biology, or if you don't believe in evolution, you don't believe in biology. But that's another point later on. The point is that this was a pretty common idea. But in the wave of fundamentalism in the 1920s, there was a huge backlash against evolution with this idea that you are destroying our old value system. And it was a big deal. So some states like Tennessee banned evolution. Partially as a backlash to voting for women's rights. It's an interesting thing how this works. And so Dayton, Tennessee wanted tourists. The city itself was opposed to that state law. So they purposely convinced John Scopes, to the substitute teacher, to just mention evolution. And by the way, here is a Pied Piper against evolution. Darwin, hypothesis of evolution, science falsely so called, towards the disbelief in God and the Bible. But he was arrested. This became a massive trial. The trial was so big, they had to have the trial out in the front yard of the courthouse. It was so packed in there, or so packed in the courthouse, so many reporters, and they actually broadcast it on the radio. William Jennings Bryan, a name from the past, who was actually pretty ill by then, but he volunteered his service to become the prosecuting attorney. Now, a lot of people accuse Bryan, therefore, of being anti-science and therefore, in a way, betraying his previous radical past. No, Bryan was opposed to the teaching of evolution because he thought the teaching of evolution would lead to the teaching of social Darwinism. That's why Bryan did this. He hated social Darwinism so much. The problem was he aligned himself with people who believed in social Darwinism. But Scopes would be found guilty. And a lot of people believe that this is going to be a victory for science, and also the idea that you can have both science and revolution and religion in different realms. And this actually goes back to some Enlightenment thinking. But actually what it led to is this massive fear of science education. And schools all over the United States after the Scopes monkey trial were fearful of teaching any kind of science because they didn't want the publicity, the backlash, the attacks by certain groups, mostly more and more being called conservative groups, that they were teaching science and disrupting the old path or the old value system like we had in the good old days. And so there was actually a real dearth of science teaching. In fact, it would not be until 1957 that there became a real movement as we got to teach science in our schools. Anybody know what happened in, oops, I thought I typed that in. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched what's called Sputnik. And Sputnik blew everybody away, the first satellite, and the realization that the communists are ahead of us. And that will lead to science education. Okay, that's where I want to quit. So we have the DBQ tomorrow. If you have any questions, please ask. And I'll do a little bit about the economy after the video. And that is it. All right, I will see you later if there's no questions. None? All right, goodbye.